All financial support for this podcast comes from my patrons on patreon.com. If you'd like to join in with the patrons, please check out patreon.com/DarwinGrosse. That's DarwinGrosse. Now enjoy the podcast. Okay, today I have the great pleasure of getting to talk to somebody new, as somebody who kind of has been bopping around in my peripheral vision for a while, mainly because of his efforts with this really cool festival out in San Francisco that everybody has been talking about. But also, as I've gotten to learn more about him, understanding his life as a live coder and even a language developer. So very exciting to get a chance to talk to Thorsten Sideboard. Hey, Thorsten, how's it going?
Hi there, Darwin. Very well. Thanks for having me on your show.
Thank you so much for being here. Like I said, I am very excited to get a chance to talk to you because you're kind of like into a whole bunch of things that really fascinate me. So to start off with, why don't we have you kind of fill people in on all the different kinds of work that you do?
Cool. Let me see. I'm trying to think of actually best place to start this, but I actually think one good part. So you can tell from the accent, I'm Scottish, and I came out to San Francisco in the late 90s for a while. I was kind of back and forth. Just after the first .com crash, I moved to London for a while. And in London, the first job I ended up at was a small music distributor, so a technical company who acted as a music distributor. This was 2002, so this was really just the birth of iTunes, like the iTunes store itself, and the start of MP3 downloads. And I got working with this music company. That was actually where I met Alex McLean, who you know is behind Tidal Cycles. Right. And even back then, so I worked closely with Alex back then, and even back then, actually, he had a band called Slub, him and this other guy, Dave. And Alex was already working on, he was doing live coding in Perl at that time. So that was very interesting. He also ran another thing which quite a big influence on me, which is called Dorkbot, people doing strange things with electricity. And he ran the London node for, I think, some other friends as well. I believe Dorkbot originally started in New York, and it's still going on. There's Dorkbot still here in SF, which I go to, which was actually funnily inspired by going to the London Dorkbot, which was run by Alex. There's all these circular dependencies which all kind of feed back upon themselves. But at that time, so hanging out with Alex, I was running a record label for 10 years called High Point Low Life, which is now still exists, but it's now more the name of my radio show, and it's the promotions name that I've been doing the Algorithmic Art Assembly under also. And actually, in fact, I put out the recent compilation, which was the first record release since 2011, I believe. But back then, I actually was doing an MP3 record label at the same time as the real record label. MP3 record label was because it was, you'd no overhead for it, but apart from your server hosting things, but you could start hosting things. And that was actually, I did a release from Alex McLean then under the Slub name. Okay. My housemate at that point in London was Leafcutter John, who's the Big Mac's MSP user as well. Jeez. And so I think it was because of the connection from me, but Alex and Leafcutter John hit it off exceptionally well as well, and would do collaborative gigs. And it was a great time in London, actually. Between myself, there was Alex, there was Eric Namor, there was the Slow Sound System, there was the Sprawl, there was all these different organisers in London, and we actually came together mostly in this one venue called the Foundry, which no longer exists. It was originally funded by Bill Drummond, the guy from the KLF, and who burned £1 million. Right. And it was an amazing venue, and that was where a lot of us got together and met up. Yeah, at that point as well, all of us organisers came together, and this was actually one of Alex's ideas as well, which was the Placard Headphone Festival. And that originated in France, and I think there'd been some crackdown on clubs, so what they started doing was doing gigs from the house, and you could tune in sort of live streaming. So even back, It started working with Alex around 2002, but I think more of these kind of festival type things, these evolved over the next couple of years. I think maybe like 2004 by this point. This is all a deep background, which actually doesn't tie too much. I'll step forward a bit more. But Alex doing the Perl live coding was actually quite a big influence on me, because I did Perl coding myself at the time, but I'd never actually thought of doing music for it. I was using more, at that time there was it Sony Acid? I believe it was that Sony that came out with that, Sonic Foundry, I think.
Well, Sonic Foundry sold it to Sony, yeah, so Sony would have been owning it at the time, yes.
Right. So I was making music and dabbling in electronic music at that point, but I was always using additional software and eventually moved on to using Ableton for years. So all this background, seeing Alex doing all this kind of live coding and that, I was always aware. He moved away from London late 2000s back up to Sheffield to start studying, and when he actually started working on tidal cycles in earnest. That was always a background to me, was just knowing that tidal cycles existed, that live coding existed, but I wasn't pursuing that by myself. And it wasn't until I moved back to San Francisco in 2011, I moved here. By that point, actually when I was moving back here, I was planning to give up the record label and focus on other more the record label was really good, but it's a lot of organization and you're almost more the infrastructure. I wanted to focus more on doing my own art. And at that point, and still is actually one of my big artistic outputs is illustration. I do a lot of comic books and science fiction and just different I've always dabbled in music, but music was never quite my creative focus. But as I got back here and I changed from the jobs I was doing I changed more from being a systems administrator, always on the technical side and writing Perl scripts, but I actually wanted to change into being more of a full-time programmer.
Okay.
I took a job at Google Nest doing this sort of hardware, embedded hardware. And by this, actually, I'd already started dabbling and doing audio stuff. And the first project that me and a friend had picked up was using Node.js. I had no idea how to actually write audio software. So my first idea for it was just a step sequencer. And I wrote a sort of basic step sequencer, which was following clock time as opposed to actual sample time. So it would kind of drift strangely, but it gave sort of nice effects. And our first brute force approach to this was actually using RabbitMQ as a messaging server, which we could both connect to. And that was how we would synchronize. Me and a friend would sort of jam together. We'd write these little Node.js scripts, which would trigger just drum samples and other weird glitchy things. That was actually quite good. That was my first foray into actually making and recording our own music software. But then I took on this job at Google Nest, and it was working with C and C++. So I kind of switched my focus over trying to learn C very quickly.
Right.
And looking for the best way to learn, of course, is to find a good project you're interested in. And having been doing some audio stuff, I decided to sort of write my own version of a live coding language. I didn't actually dig into how Tidal worked. It was more just the idea of it was the inspiration. I should make a live coding, a command line programming language for making music with. That was the sort of start of using SBShell, as it was originally called. And literally I'd taken the code. I'd been learning how to write a shell interpreter, and that suddenly I had this insight to that would be your interactive shell, so that you could actually interact with. Prior to that, with the Node stuff, I was launching little scripts which would do their job and then exit. But the idea of having this shell was suddenly you could be inside the audio and you could actually interact with the running process.
Right.
And so originally that was really just setting off sine waves. It was kind of like FM synthesis. I could have two different oscillators, one modulating the other. And I had basic commands just for sort of changing the speed of them and the just the sort of frequency of them. That was the first thing, and that's what's basically evolved into SBShell. Tying that back to Algorithmic Art Assembly, so I've been working on SBShell for, I think it's actually coming up, it's probably around 5 years. But the more I got on with that, the more I actually started interacting with the online, the Tidal Cycles community, and I became much closer to that. The closer I came to writing my own sort of working version of that. But the big moment for me was actually going out. I went out to the UK in 2018, and Alex was organizing a live coding conference. I think it had been the second live coding conference, meeting everyone in person. All these people that I'd been interacting with on the chat and on the forums, meeting them all in person was just absolutely inspiring. Just so many different, although most people are using tidal cycles or Foxdot, there's a number of other people on the peripheral that are also making their own languages. Even though they're the two larger languages, there's tons of people just making their own interpretations as well. And so actually meeting others like that was just wonderful. And actually just seeing the community around it, that was a big inspiration part, and realizing that community doesn't spontaneously arise. It really takes a lot of work to foster that community and grow that community. And that's seeing that value, that the amount of work that Alex had been doing to put into this was the big inspiration. So I came back from that holiday back to San Francisco, and that was a burning thought in my head, that why isn't there a bigger live coding scene here in San Francisco? You have so many programmers here and creatives, but it really has been watered down in a sense. There's so many, you have all these big tech companies and you have a million great programmers, but not many people that I bump into anyway combine it with their kind of creative outlet. When I first came to SF in the 90s, it was much weirder. Everyone, tech people then, had like purple hair, and like just they were much more in the weirdo spectrum. Yes. And even my time in London, like every programmer I ever worked with had some weird project on the side, whether it was visuals or music or just like programming, just to me as a creative endeavor. So like I kind of wanted to bring some of that back to SF, or revive or find some else of that. I don't believe that there's no one here doing it, but there's almost not like a beacon that pulls everyone together. And that was kind of my idea for Algorithmic Art Assembly. I wanted to showcase this live coding movement, bring people into town, but also find the others around town who were doing it, like from John Lidecker, like Kit Clayton, and just, I don't know, I wanted to like foster this very localized San Francisco, like a clarion call for others to kind of come together as well. So that was where Algorithmic Art Assembly came from. And it really was just this big inspiration from the sort of British live coding scene. Not even just Britain, that was where I had experienced it, but there's pockets all over the East Coast, Japan, Europe. And I wasn't aware of anything going on like that in San Francisco, and I wanted to like sort of be that. I seen the opportunity to put on this event.
Yeah, well, it's an event that actually caught a lot of people's attention. So the first one was last year, right?
Yeah.
And then there was a second one that was going to be this year. And then our friend, Mr. Coronavirus, came in and kind of like bonked you on the head. But my assumption is, from everything I heard, that first year was so amazingly successful. People were really, really excited about the follow-on. So my assumption is this is something you're going to continue doing, right?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. We haven't come up with a full plan for what to do for this year. But I definitely, there will be something again in the future. Like we originally rescheduled, it was March 27th and 28th for this year it was due for, and we did reschedule it to June, but I don't see it, that's still too soon, so I don't think those dates are going to happen.
Yeah.
Even so the venue I've been doing it at is Grey Area, the Grey Area Foundation for the Arts, and they have a big Art Deco theatre in the Mission, which is absolutely perfect for it. The sound system was wonderful, and they were just so good to work with. They were just so behind everything, and shout out to their sound guy Ulrich, who was, like a lot of, when you're doing extreme kind of sound and like computer music, not all sound people are kind of into what you're doing to their sound system.
Yeah, no kidding.
He would just encourage it. He's like, let's turn up this bit more. And he was great. I think everyone was so like shocked to find this like super supportive guy. I think he was definitely a big part of why all the musicians enjoyed it so much as well. The sound system was great, and we cranked it fully up, and it was it's 8-channel sound system. I think there was 4 or 5 people that used multi-channel, either 4 or 8 channels last year, to very good effect as well. So Grey Area, they've actually got their own, they have the Grey Area Festival, and that's scheduled for July this year, but they're planning to do it online. So I've still been in conversation with them, and I haven't come up with, we're still kind of discussing what to do for Algorithmic Art Assembly, whether we may try and, none of this is settled, but whether we'd maybe try and fold them together or try and just do Algorithmic Art Assembly online as well, or right. We're still kicking around ideas for that. Maybe I'll just punt on it till later in the year or next year again. Or
right. Well, one of the things that I worry about, frankly, is how venues like Grey Area are going to be able to survive while we're waiting. I actually did an informal discussion with people like, how long is it before you're going to be comfortable going to a festival and, being in a place with 500 people in a 500 capacity venue, for example, right? And everybody's like, yeah, it's going to be a while before I feel comfortable doing that,
Yeah, that could still be we may gradually move back to that, but it's certainly not going to be like, okay, everything's back to normal. Let's just jump back together. Like,
Right.
There's probably going to be like at least a year or two, I think, as we gradually find the new normal.
Right. Yeah. The new normal. That's the way to put it. Well, Thorsten, I would love to learn more about your background, because it sounds to me like you have this like real deep history of technology, and you also sort of like played down your like musical thing, except you've been running a label like forever. You have this history. I swear. I mean, my flatmate was Leafcutter John, and I was working with Alex, and I was just like, holy shit, you're right in the middle of, a pile of gods here. So I'm guessing that there's more to the story than just, hey, I did Perl scripts for a while. Tell me a little bit about your background and how you got comfortable with both technology and music, so that when all of a sudden you were around these kind of people and these kind of opportunities presented themselves, you had the background to kind of be able to do something with it.
Yeah, no worries. I turned 16 in the January of 1990, and 1990 was the year of culture in Glasgow, where all the clubs were open till 6 in the morning, 5:30 in the morning. And 1990, this acid house kind of hit 88, 89. So, right. But by 89, 90, it became more. There was so much more, like a lot of Belgian techno. Belgium is one of those places that kind of gets dropped from the history. There was actually a really good documentary I'd seen that Optimal were being interviewed by, and like Keith from Optimal as well was talking about the history of sort of Belgian techno. I guess there was R&S Records, but it was like such a big sound at that point. There's a lot of techno in Glasgow. Like Glasgow's a massive techno city, and I think it's there's a lot of the sort of Detroit legends and such came over. At that age, so 16, I was big into skateboarding at that point. My whole trajectory was supposed to be kind of going to art school, like all through school. It was, you're good at illustration, you'll go to art school. But come 1990, and I discovered clubbing. Going out to these like late night techno clubs and the stimulants that you sort of discover there as well. Right. Between with skateboarding as well, I didn't actually want to go to college or further my education. I kind of decided to start working just so that I'd have more. I had other friends who had left school early, and growing up working class in Scotland, that's quite common. But I wanted funding just so I could afford to go traveling for skateboarding. I could afford nice clothes for going out to clubs, and that Glasgow sort of clubbing and rave scene was massive influence. Like it really was like our punk rock kind of thing. At the time, I remember reading about how this was a political thing, like the government is scared. And at the time, as a young guy, I didn't see how this was political at all. But when you actually zoom out and you look at the fact you have like thousands of kids every weekend going to these illegal parties and just like total disregard for the law, you kind of see how, that's how it's political. That sounds like your disregard for the law. This is where I kind of got into music kind of thing, like buying a lot of records. And, at that time, no one had guitars. Everyone bought turntables when you were that age and you were getting into DJing. Because I ended up working for the railway rather than going to art school, and bummed around in there for a while. But I somehow actually kind of bluffed my way into doing an IT job. This was 93 or 94. So I was doing like Windows desktop support. And it wasn't a creative pursuit. It was really just now my job. But I found it quite interesting actually, and there was like these weirder sort of hacker subcultures that you would kind of come across, and the people doing like IT support were not your usual office workers. It really was like the freaks and geeks of the place, and I loved it. I fitted in perfectly. So that was I kind of got into doing like Windows desktop support. This was DOS 3.3 Novell NetWare.
Right.
Really kind of dating myself there. That was my sort of mid 90s in Glasgow, and I sort of first came out. The big influence was the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, book by Tom Wolfe. And I think that was what put the bug in my head for coming to San Francisco. And so when I first came to San Francisco, I figured I was moving away from doing tech work. Like I first came out in like 96 and I thought, I'm going to come out and do art and music full time. But then I ended up you come out here and I had to find some work. So I ended up at Stanford Research Institute just as a contract position doing Windows desktop support. But the guy I was working with had just discovered Red Hat Linux like 4.2. This was 96 or 97, I think.
Wow.
And he was like, oh, I'm stuck trying to get this like X Windows system running. And so I started helping him with that, and I fell down the rabbit hole of the Linux, which was actually way more interesting than doing like Windows desktop support. Suddenly, the work you were doing, you actually were learning things as opposed to just reinstalling and something until it worked again. You'd actually have to work out what was wrong, and you learned so much about it. And, you know, like late 90s, if you knew Linux and you knew Perl, you knew Apache web server, like suddenly you were in demand, and that was the first kind of .com boom. And so that was where I sort of got more of my like technical background. It was all like kind of self-taught from like everyone was self-taught at that point. It wasn't like the computer science degrees taught you anything about Linux or Perl or Apache or any of these necessary skills for all the sort of startups around. So that was kind of where I got. So I've always even during that time, we were putting on DJ nights as well. It was still more experimental electronic music, Boards at Canada type stuff, and like some of the kind of warp stuff as well.
But you were doing it as a consumer, right? You were listening to it and DJing it, but not necessarily making music, right?
Yeah, exactly. There was actually the first label I got involved with was in the Tenderloin here in San Francisco, and it was a friend. We were using a software called Mixman. That was it, and it was like you could basically drop in like 6
I forgot about that. Yeah.
That was the first time I made music was with that software, and then it was after that I discovered that Sony Acid and SoundForge and others. But not having that kind of musical background, it did just feel more like an extension of DJing. Like you'd sort of like jam tracks together, but it was still using this software that looks the interface for it. The whole metaphor for it is DJing, and so that .com crash kind of came, and I had to kind of go back to Europe, and I didn't want to go back to Glasgow. That's when I moved to London, and that was when I ended up in the job working with Alex McLean. And how did I meet Leafcutter? He was just kind of on the scene, and he was looking for a housemate just as I was needing like a space kind of thing. So I didn't know him too well when I moved in. We did sort of know each other. There was a lot of other Planet Move artists around. There's a whole like very burgeoning electronic scene in London. I mean, there always is, but specifically those early 2000s was a great crowd that I sort of fell in with. The guys doing Adidat records, and there was like Josh, like Posthuman. There was like scam parties. There's a lot of kind of warp stuff going on still as well. So then moving to East London was kind of incredible, actually. Then I remember when I first moved to Hackney in East London, when I was moving into the house with John. East London, especially Hackney, it's not on the tube line, so it wasn't as touristy at all. And I remember it did have somewhat of a scary reputation for it as well, which probably was more deserved maybe in the 80s and 90s. By the early 2000s, it wasn't so much, but I remember still being cautious getting in there. And the first night I'd sort of going back out to meet someone. It was a beautiful summer night, and like walking along, and there's just this massive like sound system in someone's house, like playing this incredibly good raga music, and that was when I was like, all right, this place is fucking brilliant, man. Such a great neighborhood. That's kind of the formative background of sort of music and technology. It took me into those kind of London days of sort of meeting Alex and Leafcutter and just being part of that scene.
Amazing. That's wild. So when did you first find yourself moving away from things like Acid and SoundForge into live coding? Because so I had a chance, you shared with me something you did, I think just like last weekend, which was you doing a live gig at a virtual performance called Further In. And, I kind of watch you, and you're like super adept at using this language that you built, but it seems like there's a long distance from a guy who had a label and was goofing around with Acid and SoundForge into being a guy who not only is capable of developing his own musical programming language, but also is comfortable enough to do performances with it. What is the bridge there, and when did you first start cracking live coding for yourself?
Yeah, so from 5 years ago, actually starting to learn a C programming side of things. Like up to that point, it had been more a lot of scripting, so from Perl, Python, like Node.js type stuff. But it wasn't. Then I actually started dabbling with Go, which was what took me sort of lower level and got into sort of doing C and C++. And there was a number of formative books which really educated me in the ways of just writing audio software itself. There's a guy called Will Perkle, and he has he has one massive book for doing there's one on like VST plugins, and there's one on writing your own synthesizers. So the synthesizers one, I basically spent a year implementing all of that. It's like that whole book, I basically implemented my own versions of the synthesizers that he put in there as well. There's two in particular. There's one that's a subtractive synthesizer based on a mini Moog, and there's a FM synthesizer based on a DX100. And really the core from them, his book is written in C++, and I was working in C at the time, so I wouldn't quite say ported, but I had to rewrite the sort of innards for them just so that it would work I wrote my own sort of object-oriented style of C coding. Okay. Completely different interfaces, because the ones he writes have all got kind of graphical interfaces, and it was really more the sort of core math for the actual synthesis engine, which I kind of was a part I relied on heavily. So they're two of the main instruments within my own interactive shell. I also have a step sequencer I kind of came up with myself, which uses libsnd to open samples and sort of do sample playback. But one of the other bigger components of my system, which I wrote myself more, was a granular synthesis engine, which was very much taken from. There's two core references for that. One of them is the Curtis Rhodes Microsound book, which was incredible for sort of background and just the whole understanding of conceptually how granular synthesis works. And the other one was Robert Henke, Monolake. He actually had a really detailed blog post on the Ableton site for his Granulator 2, I believe it is. And it was more how he was describing the interface to that. And so the combination of this blog post and from the Curtis Rhodes book, I managed to kind of iterate through my own implementation of granular synthesis. So that's, I feel like that's probably the most original aspect of my system itself. The combination of all of them together is what my system is really. And the interface to it is kind of quite unique as well. The fact that even though it's a live coding language, it's quite different, the metaphor, than tidal cycles or Foxtrot, which now your interface to the language is a text editor, which you then send to a back-end sound engine like Super Collider. And so mine was more the fact that I come from this sysadmin background. I was always interacting from a command shell, like SSHing into a server or just working within Bash itself. So that was kind of more the metaphor that I had, which there was an interesting aspect to that, because maybe just over a year ago, I started getting I was looking askew, I was looking sideways at these other text editors, and I was thinking, oh, maybe that's the more correct implementation. Maybe I should be more of a programming language. So actually, for my original implementation of SBShell, the interpreter for it was just literally a massive nested if-else string comparison sort of function. It's like if the string starts with FM, then go down, then follow this loop. And so it became rather large and unwieldy, and I decided to re-implement the interpreter for it as a proper lexer, parser, executor, like a proper programming language. So it actually took almost a year last year I think I started after Algorithmic Art Assembly last year, and I wasn't really done until December of just this past December there, where my program was kind of out of action. I was still working on it, but I was lost more in the implementation of a programming language. Again, I actually followed a really good book for this. There was my namesake, there was a guy called Thorsten Ball who wrote a book, How to Write an Interpreter in Go. And Go is such a clean language. You can actually, even though I was implementing it in C++, I could read the Go code and then just re-implement the version of it in C++. And so that became the interpreter for my shell. But as I was getting towards the end of this, and it's kind of JavaScript-like syntax, and it's like a proper programming language, like proper programming constructs. It has first-class functions and closures. But my initial, when I was when I got that working and starting to try and tie it back together with my sound synthesis parts, if you actually follow a real programming language, like let blah equals such and such, and big sort of longer functions, that's actually really hard to live code. It's very wordy to actually be performing with. So right. I kind of ended up realizing that I actually had like quite a nice design for, even though the actual implementation of it before was unwieldy, the actual syntax for it was quite terse and actually quite good for performing with and actually just for interacting with. So I've managed to kind of combine them together. So it's like a more terse language, but in the back end, it's like it goes through a proper abstract syntax tree, parser, lexer, executor sort of type thing. The benefit to that is that now the tokenizer can recognize tokens at any part of your command. So it's like you can kind of combine commands much more. You're not sort of tied into this sort of top-down like if-else kind of thing. So it's more sort of recursive in its implementation.
That is really interesting, and at the same time a little unnerving, because when you start tearing things apart to that level, sometimes you just never come back, right? Sometimes you can just like break it completely. But what's interesting is watching you. I kind of full screened when I watched the performance, and if you don't mind, I'm going to share a link to the performance with the listeners in the show notes.
Absolutely.
Because you really get a sense of you working the system. And you talk about sort of like the terseness of the language. And it's something that I also noticed about title cycles is that in a way, the terseness is valuable because it sort of has a graphical nature to it then, right? When you look at a string that represents a functional entity, you don't necessarily like read it left to right and verbalize things in your head in order to understand what it's doing. You kind of like look at it and encapsulate chunks of it as you look at it, like, oh, there's the pattern, oh, there's the tie-in to an instrument or whatever, right? It tends to be something that your eye-brain combination can chunk at really quickly. And it seems like that's one of the things that does really make it valuable in a live performance situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So my question is then so you have the syntax, which, I don't know title very well. How different is it from title cycles?
So there's actually, it's very different from the overall title, but there's one thing in common, which is title has this kind of mini pattern language, which is the syntax which allows you to say, play this note or this thing on, like to repeat a certain amount of times or to play every second loop or to switch between each of these. And that part, I basically re-implemented that from title, and which also I think Gibber, Charlie Roberts also has the same, he did the same sort of implementing that sort of title mini language. But that's actually a smaller part of the overall syntax. I get that, but that's the one thing when I saw you putting together patterns and stuff, I was like, some of those things kind of look like what I remember titles sort of looking like. In the way you do these pieces, you talk about how often to do them, how often to skip them, and stuff like that. So that was implemented differently. Now, I would say the one thing that was really clear watching you perform is the extent to which you have the playback engine kind of more completely integrated into your system, where title kind of depends on this super dirt engine that's running in Super Collider. From what I can tell, you kind of have a bespoke sampler engine, granular engine, and all that stuff, right? Yeah, it's all just like one program there. Like the shell itself is. So I have a number of different threads. There's the audio engine thread. There's the interpreter thread, and there's the background worker thread, which is the sort of processes. When I rewrote it, there's two larger metaphors. One is there's the sound creator engines, which are the different synthesizers, the sample loopers, the granular synth, and then there are processes which can operate, and the processes are the ones which say like every three bars do this, or like implement like every loop, re-implement this, reinterpret this pattern here. The shell itself, you basically interact. You can either create new sound generators, or you can change or create these functions which operate over them. So there was a lot of thought went into this, like what are the metaphors for actually understanding. And my original implementation was, there was no pattern. It was more sort of you just basically building and sort of like exploratory. So actually, when I rebuilt the engine last year, the kind of UI for it, this was the pattern that I managed to settle upon. and it's actually it's useful having that sort of pattern to then build upon, and it's kind of tries to keep it more simple, and it's almost like trying to think how you would explain it to others, and that sort of helps from there.
That's pretty smart. That's an interesting way of thinking about it. So now you have this thing that you called SBShell, which is the programming language that you've developed for your work. Is this something that you've shared with others, or is it still kind of your kind of like personal language? Because you talked before about how one of the things that's interesting about the live coding world is there are a couple of groups that use things like title cycles as, and as a large group, they move forward with that. But there's a fair number of people that are kind of off doing their own almost like personal languages. Do you imagine the SBShell stuff being your personal language, or do you think it's something that at some point you're going to try and share more widely?
I have been sort of leaning more towards that. With some of the more recent performances, there's a lot of people will contact me and like, oh, how do I try this and use this? And I've been developing it on GitHub, so now the source is up there and it's open, but it's not easy it's not hard either, but there's not any instructions properly for how to install it. There are some instructions, and I'm moving towards trying to make it more portable. The make file for building it has a lot of variables which are pointing to locations within my home directory in my particular setup. I've actually moved all of them into one place, and I've made them all variables. So technically it should be possible for someone to, you need somewhat of a C or C++ background just to know what to change within the make file. But if you did have that background, it shouldn't be too hard to build it at the moment. There's a couple of other libraries that it uses: Port Audio, Port MIDI, libsound, and they're the main ones. One of the major libraries that I built upon is from Ableton. It's Ableton Link. Do you know Ableton Link? It's on.
Yeah, I do, absolutely, sure.
At first, maybe after a year or two of using Soundboard or SBShell, I was on a jam with a friend, and I looked up and I found Ableton Link being this header-only library that you could use. Mm-hmm. And it actually solved a problem for me as well, because at that point, my sample loopers were literally counting samples and like sort of trying to either slow down or speed up kind of a sample so it would fit within the loop cycle for the BPM. And I could never quite work out how to, if you have any sort of drift at all, I had no solution for how to handle that. And Ableton Link basically, it was early on, it wasn't such a massive overhaul for me to like replace my timing engine with Ableton Link. And it was one of the best decisions I made. It's really useful because now I can jam with others that are using title cycles, or I can have another friend install SBShell, and we can just effortlessly sort of sync up together across the network, and that's really nice. Actually, I think it was February, we had there is now a small crowd of sort of San Francisco live coders. There's one guy there's a live coding environment he's installed within Ableton, and there's 3 other guys using tidal cycles. Okay. So we all came over to my house, and we basically had a 5-person like live coding ensemble in my house, which was, I think all of us were totally stunned. Like, it was sounding pretty good. Like, it was, we were all totally in sync, and it was like, shit, this is pretty good.
Well, Link, I'll tell you, man, every time I get a chance to use Link, I just come away thinking that there's just magic in that library, because it's surprising how well it works and how well it handles failure, what you would think of as like really clear failure points. It just seems to handle stuff with a lot of robustness. It's amazing to work with.
Yeah, actually, I've never actually read the code. I should, because it never complains. There's never any errors or dropouts. It just seems to like do the right thing. Like, it's really nicely done. Like, superb piece of engineering. Yeah,
it is indeed. That's a fact. So let's talk a little bit more about the Algorithmic Art Assembly, because, again, like I said, so many people consider that something that was really a touch point of last year. And what's interesting is I've actually had a chance to talk to some of the people that were featured there, most particularly William Fields, who was one of the people that performed there. I talked to him subsequently, and he was quite pleased with with what you had put together. How hard is it for you to develop something like that in the US? I mean, in a way, I have been hearing about the live coding community in London for ages. And there's a pretty active live coding community in Tokyo that's been around for quite a while. But it seems like in the States especially, it's all been individuals that would like show up at other gigs and stuff. How hard was it for you to even find the people that were that would make sense to have as part of this conference?
There was a number of people from how many did we have from the UK before? So via the online, I'd sort of got to know Spednar, like Kevin Bednar and Kingdom. I think they were the first people that I'd approached from the States, and I had met. It was a perfect coincidence, actually. The year before the 2018 live coding conference I'd been at in the UK was partially organised by Rennick Bell as well. So I actually got to meet Rennick and sort of hang out in the UK. And so he was actually coming on tour to the US at that point. So that was just like complete nice overlap. It was reasonably, I didn't have a short list of people. It wasn't super easy to find and fill up the schedule itself. Mark Fell was perfect. Sort of, he was almost like, he's like the kind of, the grandfather of algorithmic, modern algorithmic music.
Right.
And so everyone was so excited to meet him as well. And actually, I got his contact via Alex McLean because they both live in Sheffield and have done things together as well. So getting Mark Fell was super nice. The other one I was really excited for was Kit Clayton. I've known Josh for years, like from SF in the 90s, and like just to have someone so local who is such a legend as well. So actually, that was partially why it became Algorithmic Art Assembly rather than a sort of particularly an algo rave or live coding. There wasn't enough live coders that I could think of in the US, like locally. So I actually wanted to like just expand the vision a bit more, and it's just more algorithmic music in general. And then it tends to be this larger split between like sort of Max MSP users and systems and the sort of live coding community. And it worked really well, like kind of combining them together. So it wasn't like one algo rave night and one Max night. It was just, now we sort of switched it up in there and like lots of different people.
Well, I think that was brilliant though, because it did open a door. When I talked to William Fields, he at first was like, I'm not sure why they invited me to this because I don't do live coding, but what I do really matched up with the idea of algorithmic art. And I think that by doing it that way, you swung the door open to a more diverse set of people than folks who kind of know what each other smell like already,
Yeah, that worked really well. And actually, William Fields, I got that recommendation from Kingdom, from Mike. He recommended Sebastian Kamens and William Fields. So we have Mike Hodnick, Kingdom, to thank for that kind of expansion of that sort of northwest side of things as well.
Yeah, he's incredible. He's such a community builder. He's near me, and it's just a fabulous character to have as part of any community.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, Thorsten, we are already out of time. I just looked up at the clock and I was a little shocked. But before we go, for people who want to learn a little bit more about you, your work, maybe hear some of your music or watch some of your performances, what's the best way for people to check out your work?
The board side is my website. If you search for that, you'd find that. And that has links out to the High Point Low Life radio show on my GitHub and Instagram, which is more sort of illustrations. But there's a High Point Low Life Instagram as well, which has news about Algorithmic Art Assembly and the radio show. So I think like just starting from the boardside.com.
Yeah, man, I wish I actually literally wrote notes here. I wanted to talk a little bit more about your comic book and illustration stuff. I wanted to talk about the label of the radio show, but we just kind of ran out of time. I'm sorry about that, but maybe the next time we'll get a chance to swing on those. I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to have this talk. And I hope we do get a chance to talk again soon.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks again. Like, I listen to your podcast regular, so it's fun to I know your voice so well, but now to actually interact with it as well is kind of funny.
All right, so with that, I will let you go. But again, we will talk again soon. Have a good one.
You as well. Thanks, Darwin.
All right, bye. Many thanks to Thorsten for the great chat. It was really interesting to hear about how he got where he is, the amazing stories of people he's interacted with, people who were roommates, for Pete's sake. That's wild stuff. I want to thank you all for continuing to listen. I want to also thank all the people that reached out that were concerned about my health. I'm doing great. Finally got on the right course of meds. I seem to be coming out of it in good shape. So thank you so much for your caring. If you have any questions, concerns, comments, whatever, drop me a line, darwin.gross@gmail.com or ddg@cycling74.com or ddg@20objects.com. And also, if you're interested in following along with the transcriptions, you can always check them out at darwingross.com/AMT. That's capital A, capital M, capital T /transcriptions.html. You'll be able to take a peek at all the available transcriptions, and we're getting every week on time, plus we're going to start picking up some of the old ones. So transcriptions are out there. If you're interested, check them out. Otherwise, I'll catch you next week. Bye.